I'm going to review Dune by Herbert Walker, or at least I'm going to try. I need to make a couple disclaimers before I get into this. First disclaimer is I am new to Dune. This is my first time reading it. I know that there are a lot of people on BookTube who have read and reread this book and studied it for a long time and have a lot of thoughts on it. I've watched some of the videos. For me, though, this is the first time I've read it, and maybe other readers of this book can identify with this. There is a lot of stuff in this book, and I felt to a certain extent like it was just kind of washing over me, and I'm not quite sure what to make of it all. So this is going to be a rather superficial guide to Dune, a superficial review. You can think of this as baby steps into Dune, maybe. Treat this as a beginner's entry type thing. But the other thing is, I don't want to get into the whole story, but because of various things in my schedule, I actually finished this book back in January, and am just now at the end of March getting around to filming this review. So I'll be honest, it's not as sharp in my memory as it should be, as it would have been if I had reviewed it some 2 months ago. But I'm going to do my best, and with those disclaimers aside, let's just jump into it. So this book was published in 1965, way back when. It was serialized in a magazine first. I forget the name of it, some science fiction magazine. And then Frank Herbert shopped around for publishers. It's got a rather infamous publishing history, which I think everybody who reviews this book is contractually obligated to talk about. Herbert Walker could not find a publisher. And so he eventually, it got published by a publishing company that was famous for publishing automobile manuals. It did terrible. It was a commercial failure the first time, but through word of mouth, it gradually became a classic. I have a blogging buddy, somebody who's a little bit older than me, who remembers reading this book in the 70s and says that at that time it was considered a hippie book. I don't know what other people's perspectives or remembrance on this is, but I having read that, I can see that there's a lot of things in here that would seem to appeal to the hippies. It was published in 1965 and is largely thought to have influenced a lot of the things that came after it. So, for example, Star Wars, particularly the desert planet of Tatooine, was supposed to be influenced by Dune. You can totally see it, huh? After reading this book, you can totally imagine how Tatooine was influenced directly by this book. Brian Herbert, the son of Frank Herbert, in this edition claims in the afterword that Spock from Star Trek was influenced by the Mentats in this book, or at least he seems to imply it. It's plausible. I mean, this book came out all the way back in 1965. Star Trek didn't air until 1966. Plausible. There could have been some influence there. I don't know. The book also is talking environmentalism and ecology is a big theme of this book, and particularly how ecological systems break down if you start messing with the different pieces of it. There's a lot of themes in this book, so it's difficult to pick out what is the main theme, but certainly something that does get repeated in this book is the idea of ecology as a system, how everything works together, and that if you start taking away pieces from that system, it breaks down. I think something that gets said in the book, certainly something I've heard Frank Herbert say in interviews, is ecology is the science of understanding consequences. So you mess with one part of the ecological system, you need to understand what the consequences of that will be. So certainly with the environmental crisis that is becoming more and more a part of our lives nowadays, you can see how this book is arguably more relevant than ever. And again, it's another one of those things which strikes me as surprisingly ahead of its time because, I didn't live through this period, but I thought that the environmental movement kicked off around 1969, 70, 71, like somewhere around then. I wouldn't have thought 1965, well, even earlier than 1965, if you count that it was serialized before then. So definitely a way that Frank Herbert seems ahead of his time there. Um, yes, so where to dive in on this? Okay. Sorry, let me just introduce my edition. So this is the movie tie-in edition, which I got just because this is what was being sold at my bookstore here in Vietnam. I live in Vietnam currently as an English teacher. It is, including the appendices and the glossary and the afterword and everything, 884 pages. So you can see it's a chunker. Although that is, I don't know if you can make this out on the screen, that is with rather large print. It's, I guess you could call this maybe the airport version. It's a kind of large print, thin page book that you would find in airport lobbies. According to Wikipedia, they were saying it's 412 pages. So I imagine, the original hardcover maybe had bigger pages and smaller print. But yeah, it is a chunker. I read this up when I was at my in-laws' place for Tet holiday, the Lunar New Year holiday here in Vietnam. And I actually finished it off in 6 days, which is good for me. I'm a slow reader. In the past, I've taken months to finish books with this page count. Now, granted, I was on vacation, so I largely had nothing else to do but read during the day. Granted, this is big print, but still, it was good reading for me, which I guess must attest to the fact that the book sucked me in to a certain extent. Even though I have a lot of complaints to make about the plot and the pacing and stuff like that, I couldn't have been all bad, right? Because I got through the whole thing in a week. There is quite a plot to this. This is one of those books where the hero goes on such a journey, so that when you're at the end of the book and you're looking back at all the things that have happened to the hero and the tremendous change in his life station and position from where he started out to where he ended up, you're like, wow, that was quite a story. I can't believe all those big changes happened to this character over the course of the book. I mean, it's a big book, but there is a lot of plot in here. There are quite a few twists and turns along the way, so it is, as much as possible, a book that you would want to go into spoiler-free. That being said, though, it's also relatively spoiler-proof in the sense that there's not just one big thing that spoils the story. So it's not like, you remember that old video when the Harry Potter books got released and people were going to the bookstore to spoil it by yelling out, spoilers, Snape kills Dumbledore, and spoiling the book by yelling it from the car window. This is not a book that you could spoil by just yelling something from the car window. You'd have to sit down next to somebody for 30 minutes and listen to them recount the plot. There's just so much that happens. That being said, though, as you guys know if you've watched my videos in the past, I tend to talk about books for 30 or 40 minutes at a time. I guess count that maybe as your spoiler warning here for this video. Um, the book has been widely praised as the greatest science fiction novel of the 20th century, including by several people on BookTube. Again, I'm influenced once again here by Steve Donahue. Yeah, and William over at Williams Library has done a video on the Dune series as well. Yeah, Steve Donahue has done several videos on Dune, and he's called it the greatest science fiction book of the 20th century. I was surprised then when I started reading it at how clunky the prose was and how clunky the dialogue was. Now, if you read a lot of science fiction, you're not surprised when the prose is a little bit bad. You know, there's a lot of grade B science fiction out there, pulp science fiction where authors just churn these out. But that's not what this is supposed to be, right? This is supposed to be like the greatest science fiction book of the 20th century. So it was surprising to realize how clunky the prose was, and the dialogue was. It pulled me out of the book to a certain extent, especially in the first few chapters. I'd be reading the dialogue and I'd be thinking, that's not how people talk. And again, the disconnect between how much this book had been praised and the terrible dialogue was something that stuck in my mind. As I kept reading, though, it was something that bothered me less and less. And at the time, I attributed it to the fact that I was just getting used to it, or I was just, getting so involved in the story that I had just stopped noticing these things. There is Steve Donahue in one of his Dune read-alongs, though, does address this. And he says that the dialogue is particularly bad. Sorry, the dialogue and the prose is particularly bad in the early chapters because they had gone through so much redrafting over the course of this book being written, and it was written over a period of years, that Frank Herbert just lost the ability to see those pages. Steve Donahue says anybody who's a writer out there will be familiar with this. I'm not really a writer, although I'm a blogger, so I can identify with this in my own way. Certainly, blog posts that I've gone over 2 or 3 times, to a certain extent, you do kind of lose the ability to kind of see it as a reader would see it after a while. And Steve Donahue is of the opinion that the book does get better as you go on. The prose style does. So I mean, I didn't see that video of Steve Donahue's until after I had finished this book, but that does jive with my own experience. I did find the first few chapters clunky. I found it much smoother as I got into. I at the time attributed it to just getting used to the book, but it could be that the prose style improves. I don't know. What do you guys think? Leave me a comment if you have opinions about that. The book is there's a lot of things going on. It struck me as somewhat comparable to Game of Thrones, and I'm a little bit sheepish about using that comparison because I've been guilty of overusing that comparison on this channel. Whenever I'm reviewing something with a complex plot, I always say it's like Game of Thrones. But it is kind of like Game of Thrones. There are all these different houses that are competing against each other. Now, unlike Game of Thrones, we don't see all the different houses. We hear about them. We know that there's some sort of feudal system with the emperor at the top and a bunch of nobility houses down beneath them. But we don't really the only houses that we really get to know are the houses of our heroes, the Atreides, and the houses of the villains, the Harkonnens. I guess while I'm mentioning the Harkonnens, I should echo something that Steve Donahue said in his video review of this, which is a weak point of the plot, if you wanted to pick one, is that the Harkonnens are just cartoon villains. That there's no moral complexity to them. They're just largely evil for the sake of being evil, and they're evil kind of all the way through, like all the members of that house. So, again, to compare it to Game of Thrones maybe does a better job of playing playing at the moral ambiguity. Not so much here. But similar to Game of Thrones, within these two houses, the Harkonnens and the Atreides, we've got different subordinates, and the men who are serving both houses, and they both have their own agendas. Sorry, they each have their own agendas. So there's a lot of different wheels going on in this plot. The action in the second half of the book, the plot slows down a bit, and we are treated to a lot of how to describe this. The main character starts to get into these spiritual trances, which are aided by drugs. I guess you can see why this book might have been popular with the hippies. Aided by substances, which allow him to reach these spiritual transcendental planes. And we get these weird, trippy passages which describe his mystical experience. Again, apparently this book was popular with the hippies back in the day. And those are a little bit weird, change of pace from the previous kind of Game of Thrones type style plotting. In my opinion, they also start to get a little bit repetitive, I thought. So there are several mystical trance sections, and they seem to be hitting on the same themes over and over again. There are a lot of themes in this book. Religion is a big one. There's some sort of Islam offshoot, which is also mixed in with Buddhism or Eastern religions. And of course, there's Christianity is thrown in the mix. There's a lot of talk about destiny and the future and how mutable the future is and how much free will we have. There's just a lot of stuff in this book. I was listening to an interview with Frank Herbert, which I'll try to remember to link in the description down below. And Frank Herbert was saying, well, the book works on multiple levels. So you can read it several times, and each time you read it, you can pick it up on a different level. And he may well be right. I don't know. I've not read it several times. I am, after my first reading, a little bit at a loss to say how well the book is dealing with its themes. I don't know. Like I said, there's a lot in here, and it just kind of washed over me. There's a lot in here. How well does Frank Herbert deal with these themes, or how much new stuff does he have to say about the stuff he's talking about? I don't know. I may have to reread this book at one point. Yeah, I don't know. The book, aside from maybe a couple chapters at the very beginning, the book is set almost entirely on this desert planet, and again, this is supposedly where Tatooine in Star Wars got its inspiration. And yeah, Frank Herbert was influenced, among other things, by Lawrence of Arabia, and Lawrence of Arabia's story was one of the inspirations for this book. A messianic figure who arrives in the desert. Now, it's this is a very common observation. It's something I hesitate to say because it's so obvious, but the setting of a book influences my mood. You know, the power of imagination, right? I noticed that. I talked about this on this channel last year when I was reading The Return of the King. And I was, you know, there's all those chapters with Frodo and Sam on the mountain of Mordor. And I talked about how that I found those chapters a bit depressing just because of the bleak, barren atmosphere on Mordor. And it was odd because, you know, I was reading them in a perfectly nice environment. If I was to look around my environment, you know, here in Vietnam, sunny day, blue skies, palm trees outside, but just you see what you imagine, right? So if you're reading something that has a bleak and barren setting, that you feel like you're in that bleak and barren setting. All of which is maybe a long way of saying that books with beautiful settings tend to refresh my mind. In stories or books with bleak and barren settings tend to depress me a little bit. And Dune, with the desert planet setting, I found that this was not the most pleasant place that I would have chosen to spend 884 pages. I would prefer reading a book about a tropical rainforest with lush green vegetation or waterfalls or something like that. But I don't know. I suppose there is a beauty to the desert, a Lawrence of Arabia style mystique. Again, let me know in the comments how you guys found this book. I found this the setting of the book and just the relentless descriptions of the desert and the heat and stuff like that to be something that was a bit of a barrier to my enjoyment of the book. But I know that's a shallow way to approach a book. I'm old enough where I should be able to read some should be able to have the self-discipline to read stuff that isn't always unicorns and rainbows. But yeah, that is what it is. So, what else do I want to say about this? I may just finish things off here. Oh, no, maybe there's one more point here. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue on with the sequels or not. I'm given to understand, I've not researched this in depth deliberately because I don't want to expose myself to too many spoilers. But I'm given to understand that the subsequent books turn some of the themes of this book on its head, or there's a narrative of a Messiah that's set up in this book, which is subverted in the previous book. Subverted in the subsequent books. So perhaps you have to read the whole thing to see where Frank Herbert is really going with this. The whole thing meaning the whole series. at this point. I'm not sure if I'm going to do that or not. But yeah, those are some of my thoughts on this first book.